It's a pleasure to be here to talk with you regarding your 2024 Continuing Competence Program submissions and what you need to know and think about with regard to completing your CCP, which is one component of your registration renewal for 2025. My name is Susan Raffett, and I am Deputy Registrar at AXLPA. I know we're continuing to have a few people join us right now. I can hear people coming online. We'll start here with our agenda for today, which is outlined on this slide. And we will have time for questions at the end of the webinar. But I'm also happy to entertain questions as they come up. So I would just ask that you enter your questions in the chat, and then Paula, who's one of our regulatory coordinators, can let me know if there is a question that's been entered, because I will not be able to see the chat as I'm providing this presentation. As I said, we will have some time at the end for questions as well, so you can certainly hold your questions until that time also. So I'm just going to provide a little bit of information for you all about last year's CCP statistics, kind of as a jumping off point for what we're talking about today. This slide speaks to the audit of continuing competence program submissions from last year. So the information was actually entered into the system, reflecting on activities that folks completed in 2023. And the audit of those submissions was completed this year in 2024. You'll see that a total of 445 submissions were audited this year. And I should mention that the total number of regulated members that were audited is in line with the expectation that approximately 20% of registrants will be audited each year, so that over a 5-year period, all registrants will have been audited. You'll note that the numbers are a little bit higher, like at around the 27% mark, because we automatically audit all new registrants who have just completed their first continuing competence submission, just to ensure that they're on track and getting the support that they need. And prior to this year, which I'll talk about later, we did allow individuals to opt out of the peer dialogue portion of the CCP requirements. However, if people did that, then their submission would automatically be sent to audit. So that explains why our numbers are a little higher than the 20%. You'll also see on this slide that of the 445 submissions that were audited, 93 were referred to the next phase of our competence program, which is the interview stage. And programs that were referred on, individuals who were referred on to the interview, it was really because there might be some questions regarding the content that was audited. There may have been an incomplete submission or some need for clarification, and really just wanting to ensure that requirements were met. And you can see that of the 21% of audited programs that were sent to interview, none of those actually were referred or needed to be referred to the next stage of our program, which is the record review. I'll also just provide you with some information here about the inaugural registered members engagement survey that we completed at AXLPA earlier this year. One of the items that we asked for feedback about was our CCP, and so we felt it would be important to share that with you today as we're reviewing our CCP and requirements as we go forward. So registered members were asked to indicate any concerns with the annual renewal process as part of this survey. And this slide illustrates that 36% of regulated members who responded to this question reported that they had concerns with the CCP component of renewal. And the next slide will speak to this in a little more detail. So what registrants told us in relation to the CCP, of the 103 people who felt that the CCP was difficult or they had some concerns, the breakdown of their responses is as follows. 74%, so the overwhelming majority of folks felt that the CCP was too time consuming. 35% felt it required too much effort. 33% felt it was confusing or they were unsure about how to complete a particular step. 16% said they didn't think that the CCP should be required as part of AXOPA's renewal process. 9% had technical difficulties, and another 22% had specific concerns that they specified on the survey, and I don't actually have access to what those specific concerns were as part of this presentation. With regard to that fourth point about not people thinking that CCP should not be required as part of AXOPA's renewal process, I just wanted to clarify that, of course, CCP is mandated by the provincial government in legislation, so we don't actually have a choice about whether we have a program or not. Several years ago, the decision was made to incorporate it into our renewal process, and if it didn't occur at the time of renewal, we would still need to find a time of the year for submissions to be made. So some of you may remember that at one time CCP submissions were required by the end of June, I believe, which was also not an ideal time, particularly for members who work in the educational system. All of this to say that there may never be an ideal time of year to complete these requirements, but the requirements are there in legislation nonetheless. In response to some of this feedback that we received from registered members, we have made some changes to the forms used as part of CCP for this year, and that's something we're going to walk through as part of the presentation. And I think really ultimately we're hopeful that these changes will reduce the amount of time taken to complete the CCP and to also reduce any confusion regarding the steps. So just to mention that there are some things that have not changed with our CCP, and those are really the conceptual foundations and format of the CCP. You're still going to be asked to report on 3 different CCP activities, one being continuing education, one being peer dialogue reflection, and one being a risks and supports profile. And you will be asked to participate in audit, in an interview, and in the practice assessment stages as required. So I think it's important to remember that really the substance of the program stays the same. And I just also want to mention just quickly that we don't ask you to report all of your continuing education in a given year, just that you have to report on 2 activities that you completed during the year, and we will go into that in more depth. But I always think it's good to remember that, because many programs, and particularly folks who are involved with SAC or with ASHA, have a requirement to report all of their continuing education, and that is not what we ask at AXOPA. So what we have done is focused on trying to improve the readability and ease of completion of the CCP forms. We've tried to increase the clarity of instructions and prompts so that it's clear what type of information we're looking for you to provide. We've eliminated the competency area headings that are used in our national competency profiles for the professions. So you no longer have to identify whether a competency falls under a particular heading, such as scholar, professional, manager, etc. And we've also tried to make some improvements to our scoring rubric and have updated sample example submissions that are available on the website. If you're looking just for an idea of how these forms, what we're kind of expecting from people. And we will go through these in a little more detail. I will just mention quickly too, before we start going through the forms, that the opt-out option for the peer dialogue reflection has been removed this year. And I think the feeling was really that rather than, just opting out of that piece, if someone feels they require an accommodation regarding completion of the CCP, we would just ask that you contact the ACSLPA office to make that request. I've cut and pasted onto this slide some of the types of reasons for which an accommodation may currently be granted. But also to let you know that if you have other reasons that don't fit into this that you think you would like to discuss with us at ACSLPA, please feel free to contact us and we will have that conversation. The page 11 of our Continuing Competence Program Manual, which is available on the website, does outline additional details regarding the accommodation request process. And so we would just ask that you get in touch as soon as you think you might be needing an accommodation, because we do require at least 5 business days to process this type of a request. And for this year, the last day an accommodation request can be submitted would be on December 20th for this 2025 renewal. And just as soon as you feel like this is something you might need to discuss, we would really appreciate hearing from you. And I would also just say, in regards to getting things done, I would really encourage you to please not wait until the last minute to complete your CCP. Last day for renewal is December 31st, but I think it's fair to say that we know the CCP does take time. Having heard from people who completed our survey, we know that it takes more time than people would like it to take. And so if you can give yourself a little bit of time and start this process at least a few days prior to our deadlines for renewal, you will be in a better position, and we'll be able to support you better if you have questions. I'd also say you're probably at this webinar because you're interested and you're wanting to know what to do. I would share this information with your colleagues as well, that getting on to the portal and looking at your continuing competence a few days prior to our deadlines would be a really great thing to eliminate stress, I think, for all involved. So just a little plug there. In terms of the timeline then, our renewal has actually already opened. It opened on November 1st and it closes on December 31st. In January, ACSLPA staff follow up with late renewals. We suspend practice permits where that's necessary, and we prep the documentation that's needed for the auditors to review. And our audit will begin in February. So it's really an unavoidable feature of the system that audits and follow-up does take place sometime after the regulated members' reflections are completed. So all I can say is just please don't expect it any earlier than February, and it will take a few weeks for our auditors to review everything and get information back to people who have been chosen for the audit. So let's do a little walkthrough now of the CCP forms themselves so you can see what they look like. I do think that the process to fill them out is quite self-explanatory, and honestly, if I can do it, I think pretty much anyone should be able to do it. I'll try to provide a few tips and tricks along the way. I will just mention again, because changes were made to the forms, the majority of AXPA members will see the new forms when you go into the registration portal, the renewal portal, I should say. But anyone who started their CCP prior to October 20th, and I think there were about 25 people who did that, you're going to still see the old format of our forms because you had entered information into the system that we didn't want to lose. And if this applies to you, but you would like to access the new forms, you can call the AXPA office and we will be able to give you access to the new forms. It's fine if you want to finish out using the old forms, but just know that you can request the new forms. And as I said, that's for people who started their CCP and entered information prior to October 20th. Not a lot of people, but there are a few. Okay. So the first page that will show up when you're in the CCP portion of the renewal portal is the continuing education report. And you can start with this form, but you don't have to. You can see along the top of this screenshot, there are three tabs: continuing education report, peer dialogue reflection, and risks and supports profile. If you wanted to start with the peer dialogue or with the risks and supports, you could click on that and it would show up for you and you could complete that form first. It's up to you, but just so you know that this is typically the first form that will show up. Sorry, 1 minute. I don't think that moved. There we go. So from the drop down, it says at the top of this form, it gives you instructions. From the drop down, you're to select 2 activities that you engaged in this year to support your practice. You would provide information for the activities you selected and describe how you applied or will apply what you learned from the identified activities in your professional practice. And we'll look at this in a little more detail, but I wanted to mention here, you'll see that you're asked to choose from the drop down the category of continuing education that you think your activity falls under, and then you're supposed to fill in an approximate date started, when you started that activity this past year and when you ended it. And I just want to let people know that, for example, if you completed a 2-hour webinar on February 10th, that would be the date started. The approximate date ended would need to be after that date, so February 11th, for example, which may not be that intuitive. You'd assume if it's a 2-hour session that it started and ended on the same day, but our system needs you to give 2 different dates. So just be aware of that. And then again, here we have a couple of examples of how you would fill out the form. I apologize if it's not really easy to see, but you can access these sample filled out forms on our website. If you go into if you go in under members on the AXPA website menu at the top, and you go in under continuing competence, there is a drop down or a sort of an accordion kind of option that you can choose from that provides you with the rubrics and the sample forms to have a look at. So on this particular slide, you can see on sample answer 1, the activity category that this person chose was mandatory college-directed activities. They put the date started and ended, and in this case, the specific activity they completed was AXPA jurisprudence modules, and then they provided information about how that completion of those jurisprudence modules would impact their competence, how they've applied or would apply or will apply, I should say, what they've learned from the activity. So this clinician commented on how the jurisprudence modules help them understand and develop a strong basis for the procedures and policies here in Alberta, and that they now have a more concrete understanding of the legislation and acts that are important to audiologists in this province, as well as the tools and references to refer to during their practice. The second example focuses on the category of attendance at an education activity, and in this case it was an ASHA webinar on building a culturally inclusive and gender-affirming space, and the individual provided details about who the presenters were of that activity, which is great. That's helpful. And then they provided some information about how this webinar has helped them to think about how they communicate differently with their clients, and they've specified 3 different ways that they are communicating differently based on the information they learned in this webinar. So once you've completed these 2 continuing education kind of reports, then you'll see on this slide it says note after answering the form, click on the bottom on the lower right side of the page to move to, in this case, the Peer Dialogue Reflection tab. It will tell you what the next tab is that you will be moving to, and you need to click on that to get to the next form for your completion. If you need to wrap up things for the time being and come back to complete your submission later, click on Save for Later, and then your information will be saved and available to you when you come back at a later date to keep going with your submission. I also just want to mention it's really important to remember to save your work periodically as you complete your CCP, or the contents will be lost, and that is of course not what you want. I have learned this the hard way myself, so I would just suggest, write yourself a sticky note in big letters that says save work when you're going through and doing this, just to ensure that you remember. Because I know particularly if you start finding yourself wordsmithing and thinking and reflecting, you will time out. So it's really important to just save your work as you go. So now we move to the peer dialogue reflection, and the idea behind the peer dialogue reflection is that it's important to share with colleagues and to learn from one another, to benchmark one's own practice with others, and to gather new perspectives and practice ideas through discussion. The literature suggests that isolation can be a risk to one's competence, so building in opportunities for peer reflection is important. I suspect most of us do this without really even thinking about it, and you may actually have many peer discussions that you would choose from when you're completing this form. It doesn't have to be anything grandiose, but an example of how discussion impacted your learning and your practice, and maybe it confirmed your approach to intervention, or perhaps it resulted in a change. So just like to also remind you that you can enter your peer reflection at any time throughout the year, and you don't have to wait for renewal. So if you have a particularly good conversation with someone, you might think, oh, I'm going to enter that today, and you can go in and do that. And in fact, as of January 1st, 2025, you'll be able to go in at any time starting right at the very beginning of the year to enter your reflections or to enter other CCP information. So you want to describe a situation you discussed with your peer mentor or supervisor. You want to provide information about your peer and why you chose them. And that really is nice as a reflection for yourself too, about what are you looking for in a peer whose input you're seeking. And then you're going to describe how that dialogue impacted your practice. And here we have some examples again, which again you can take a look at on the website. One of these examples talks about someone who had new clients who stutter, and so they were looking at, completing the assessments for these clients, identifying goals, brushing up on their knowledge of different treatment approaches, and wanted to sort of just benchmark that and double check that with a colleague who has more expertise than they did in treating fluency disorders. And so they then identify in their reflection what they learned from having that conversation and how they're going to implement some of that learning in the future. There's also an audiology example here that talks about working with families and patients. Again, after you've completed filling out this section, and you will note too that all of these dialog boxes have a maximum number of characters that you can enter. And sometimes, if you're like me, you might get a little long-winded, and then you go, oh, it's now stopping me from adding any more characters. I better rethink how I can say that. And so then you have to go back and trim and cut and change and just get a little more efficient in your wording. Another reason why it's good to give yourself time to do these things, because sometimes you do have to go back and do that editing so that you can get everything in that you think is most important for the auditors to see. So again, here you see at the bottom of the slide, note after answering the form, click on the button on the lower side of the page to move to the risks and supports profile. In this case, if you want to save for later, you would click on that, but don't click on next until you've completed all components of the CCP. So now the last section that I'm going to address is the risks and supports profile. And we've changed things around with the risks and supports profile this year, whereby we now start with the supports page prior to addressing the risks. And, you know, we try to use a strengths-based approach with our clients. So I think it's also nice to use a strengths-based approach when we consider our own learning and our own sort of self-reflection. We revised the forms this year so that when you enter supports to your competence, you do not have to provide a specific example of a situation where a support was used, nor do you have to reflect on the support. But you will still, however, need to describe at least 2 risks that did or could adversely impact your practice, and also identify supports that were used or could be used to mitigate those risks. So I just also want to remind folks that this section of the CCP is based on literature that is available with regard to the impact of risks and supports on professional practice in the healthcare domain. We know that there are things that can impact our practice both positively and negatively. So again, we have a couple of sample answers on the risks and supports profile, and you can see that you're asked to identify what a risk might be. In the first sample, we have professional isolation was the risk that was identified, and then a description of how this risk could impact one's professional practice, and then identifying at least one support that you could put in place to mitigate that risk. And then the other example we have is another risk is adequacy of practice preparation, and the risk that could impact there was just transitioning to a new role where one doesn't have as much background. Training, for example, could be a risk, and so needing to make sure that they complete continuing education in areas where they feel they have a lot of catching up to do. So again, please feel free to look at all of these samples on the website if you think they would be helpful to you. So then again, just like on the other slides, you're going to click it once you've completed all 3 of the different areas. You're going to click Next now to save your CCP entries, and that will take you to the next sections of the renewal, and you'll be done the CCP entries. So tips for success, just a few things to remember. To To pick continuing education activities and peer dialogues that resulted in changes to your practice. That really helps your reviewers, your auditors infer that your practice was positively impacted by the activity. It's also really important that you discuss how your practice was impacted and not what you taught someone else or what you did to impact a client's speech, language, or hearing skills. So, for example, I learned some things from a webinar that I completed that I will consider when I prepare messages and training for others. But I needed to remember to focus on what my learning was. So my learning was that I have to consider different communication styles and perspectives of the people I'm reaching out to when I develop a message. That was my learning, and that will improve my competency because it will make me a more effective communicator. So that's really the focus. How does whatever you were learning impact you and your practice? And you want to provide sufficient information to your auditor. They're most likely not familiar with your context, so you want to avoid acronyms. You need to provide a short description of the site-specific contextual features, just to help somebody who's reading your submission understand kind of what you're talking about. And this is where I think sometimes when there's not enough information, a program can end up getting forwarded to an interview, and then that's cleared up. But again, if you give yourself enough time up front, hopefully you'll be able to provide that information, and then an interview may not be required. So finally, just some resources for members. There's a link here to the resources around the rubric, example submissions, and frequently asked questions. And I believe I already shared with you how you can get to those if you go in and you look for under the members section of the website, continuing competence, and then you can just kind of scroll down through the information that's there. And AXIPA staff is happy to answer questions about general process, content, IT difficulties, you name it. Depending on what it is you're asking about, we may need to direct your question to a different individual, but you can contact us via the AXIPA website. We have a contact us spot on our website. You can phone the office, or you can use the ccp@axipa.ca email address, and your inquiries will be forwarded on to the appropriate person. So I think I'm going to leave it there in terms of actual kind of content. Okay, I see a question there. This is likely in the FAQs. Returning from maternity leave in January 2025, is there an option to indicate this, or do I need to contact AXIPA about this specific situation? Well, I think if I understand that correctly, if you've been non-practicing and you're coming back and you're renewing as practicing for January 1st, we actually will require that you complete the CCP. And part of the rationale for that is because you're going to be going through a transition, and so you're coming back from not actively practicing. So some of these items, the risks and supports profile, I think you should be able to answer quite easily. It could be, for instance, that a specific risk might be that you are now transitioning from not having work to working. So there's some things you have to think about that and get yourself back up to snuff. The continuing education activities, if you've done any education activities while you were off, you can report on those. It could even be as simple as just reading a couple of articles and providing some context on that as you prepare yourself to get back to practice. And the peer reflection, again, if you have somebody that you can have a quick conversation with, or if something comes to your mind over this past year, you can still incorporate that. So that is something that we do ask that people complete as they're moving into an active practice or renewing for January 1st. Any other questions or comments? Okay. I see that we can use 1,000 words maximum. Is there any minimum number of words? It's actually characters. I think it's not words. So it's like characters being letters and spaces and such. As far as I know, there is no minimum. Having said that, though, one letter response isn't going to cut it, obviously. So I would say that, brief and to the point, as long as you're covering what needs to be covered and you're answering the questions, that would be great. I didn't mention this before, but actually that just reminded me that we do a kind of a random spot check of 2 to 3% of submissions, just to make sure that they are completed and that they don't just have odd characters or random kind of entries. So obviously they need to make sense and answer the questions that are being posed. The webinar will be posted, I believe, on our YouTube page. Not right away, but certainly in the next little bit. And so again, if you have things you want to go back to check, you can do that. You can utilize the resources on the website, and please encourage your colleagues, if they have questions, to just spend, what was it, 35-40 minutes to have a look at the webinar if they would like some of their questions answered. Also, we are available, of course, as I mentioned previously, if you want to send us an email or send us a phone call, and we'll do our best to answer your questions. Have a great rest of your day, everyone, and you know where to find us if you need to talk. Thank you so much.